Elon Musk just said there is a lot of current year similarities to 1929. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from the stock market crash of 1929 to 1939. S&P 500, for example, in just a few years dropped more than 80%. I think we can all agree we do not want this to happen. Elon specifically responded to Cathie Wood, so let's see what she was saying. While the US banking system was seizing up in response to bank runs threatening regional banks, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other crypto networks didn't skip a beat. Instability in the banking system threatened stablecoins, the on-ramps to DeFi, in stark contrast to regular rhetoric. Instead of blocking decentralized, transparent, auditable, and well-functioning financial platforms with no central points of failure, regulators should have been focused on the centralized and opaque points of failure looming in the traditional banking system. That is a pretty good idea. How come they were not paying any attention to these banks that had these huge unrealized losses? I mean, this was sort of obvious. If you are in that industry and you look at banks basically every day, I don't think this came to you as a surprise at all. Many people are completely outraged that Greg Becker, the Silicon Valley Bank CEO, sold $3.6 million worth of shares on February 27th, just days before the bank disclosed a large loss that triggered its stock slide and collapse. The good news here, though, is that the SEC and Justice Department are investigating SVB's collapse, including insider stock sales. Hopefully, they find out exactly what happened, and if there was insider trading, there should be punishment. If he just bankrupted a regular company, this wouldn't have been a big deal, but he didn't. He bankrupted a bank that could have brought down the whole regional banking system in the US and do permanent damage to the US economy. Cathie Wood continues, they should have been all over the crisis that was looming in plain sight. Asset and liability duration mismatches, a short rate soared 19-fold in less than a year, and deposits in the banking system were falling on a year-over-year basis for the first time since the 1920s. If you were looking at banks, I mean, you must have sort of seen this possibility, certainly, assuming that the interest rates kept going up, which they did. Warren Buffett, for example, certainly understands banks very well, and in retrospect, Berkshire Hathaway cut its position in regional banks at the right time. When? In the final quarter of 2022. I wonder if perhaps he picked up a lot of cheap banks just now. Berkshire Hathaway was sitting on nearly $129 billion in cash at the end of 2022. Cathie Wood certainly has a point here, but what Elon Musk is saying, whoa, that's a little scary. Just to be clear, there's no way I am selling my Tesla stock. I believe Tesla is extremely well positioned to thrive, and I believe if we do have a terrible crisis, Tesla, I think, would actually thrive. Think about how well Tesla did during the 2020 crisis. All other automakers were struggling to get their hands on chips. In the meantime, Tesla just got any chips, and then they reprogrammed their software wherever they needed, and boom, they were able to continue as usual. While others were really struggling, Tesla was able to adapt. I think it would be the exact same thing. Sure, maybe Tesla stock would collapse for a moment, and maybe that moment would be a long moment. I don't mind, because Tesla, I believe, would capture the market share that other automakers have right now, and long term, that would be good. But let's see what exactly happened during the Great Depression.
But if I had to name a single cause of the Great Depression, it might be America's weak banking system. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Although the Federal Reserve System had been created in 1913, the vast majority of America's banks were small, individual institutions that had to rely on their own resources. When there was a panic and depositors rushed to take money out of the bank, like they do in the obscure art house movie Mary Poppins, the bank went under if it didn't have enough money on reserve. So in 1930, a wave of bank failures began in Louisville that then spread to Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and eventually Arkansas and North Carolina. As depositors lined up to take their money out before the banks went belly up, banks called in loans and sold assets. Ultimately, this meant that credit froze up, which was what really destroyed the economy.
That is why Elon Musk is saying that the current year has similarities to 1929. We just had bank runs. Hopefully they have stopped and the government stepped in to prevent any more bank runs. In the last video, if you haven't seen it, I explained how we don't really know if we are still experiencing a huge run on banks. It could be happening and we may not even know it. Hopefully it's not happening. It seems like it is not. So it's probably fine. But we won't know until Thursday because the government basically is telling us we are not going to tell anyone if we have any banks failing, although we will post how much money we are using to fund these banks if indeed funding is needed right here, but that will only be published this Thursday, so very soon, but still we will only know then with certainty that okay, we are fine or not fine.
A frozen credit system meant that less money was in circulation, and that led to deflation. Now, you're probably thinking, big deal, deflation can't be as bad as inflation, right? No, deflation is much worse, as anyone who has ever slept on an air mattress knows. When prices drop, businesses cut costs, mainly by laying off workers. These workers then can't buy anything, so inventories continue to build up and prices drop further. Banks weren't lending money, so employers couldn't borrow it to make payroll to pay their workers, and more businesses went bankrupt, leaving more and more workers unable to purchase the goods and services that would keep the businesses open.
Yeah, I don't think we really need to worry about deflation. If anything, we need to worry about inflation. The inflation is too high, so if you are looking at that, this is looking nothing like 1929. Back then, there was basically no inflation leading up to 1929. And if you compare our current numbers, for example, $1 in 2020 is worth $1.13 in 2022. Inflation, I don't think, is something that they were worried about back then, but right now, that is the real big problem here.
So if we have to lay the blame for the Great Depression on someone, we can blame the banks, which isn't completely wrong, and it gives us a chance to shake our fists at Andrew Jackson, whose distrust of central banking got us into this mess in the first place. That's probably too simple, but the Federal Reserve does deserve a good chunk of the blame for not rescuing the banks and not infusing money into the economy to combat this deflationary cycle.
If you had to describe the complete opposite of what our politicians and government officials would do in a time of crisis, I think that was it. Sure, we just had bank runs and multiple banks did fail, just like they did right before the Great Depression, but our government officials, I believe, would certainly step in if we had a bank run again or multiple bank runs, and certainly if it was a systemically important bank. So while certainly there are similarities, I don't think it is really fair to compare these two different times. And from time to time, I hear people saying, oh, we have to go back to the gold standard. That would fix all of our issues, right? Wrong. I mean, why did we have a Great Depression then? If a gold standard fixes everything, why did we literally have a Great Depression? It started while we were still on the true gold standard.
By the end of 1931, 2,294 American banks had failed, double the number that had gone under in 1930.
That is bonkers! Not 200. 2,000! And if you look at the total number, some 7,000 banks have failed throughout this period. During the 2008 crisis, my family suffered terribly. And during that time, only a few hundred banks have actually failed. It was not that big of a number if you compare it to the Great Depression. And in some ways, I think a bank run can be done much faster today than before, because now everyone has a smartphone, there's social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. The panic spreads super fast. So today, I think it is even more important that the government, if it is going to do something, that it does it basically immediately.
Let's take the foreign debt issue. Hoover proposed a moratorium on intergovernmental debt payments, and he actually got Congress to go along with it. But it wasn't enough, mainly because the central bankers in Europe and America refused to let go of the gold standard, which would have allowed the governments to devalue their currency and pump needed money into their economies. And when Britain, rather heroically I might add, did abandon the gold standard in 1931 and stopped payments in gold, the US did not follow suit, which meant that world financial markets froze up even further. Like, this is a little bit complicated, but if you and I have always used Cheetos as currency to exchange goods and services, and one day I announce that we can't really do that anymore because it doesn't give us the flexibility that we need to pull ourselves out of this deflationary spiral, if I don't also agree to abandon Cheetos, then it's going to be a total disaster, which it was.
That would not be a problem at all today, because the US got off the gold standard in 1971 completely, and basically no one is on gold standard anymore.
In January 1932, he and Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was basically a federal bailout program that borrowed money to provide emergency loans to banks, building and loan societies, railroads, and agricultural corporations. The problem was that by 1932, bailing out the banks wasn't enough, and the Great Depression started to take shape. By early 1932, well over 10 million people were out of work, 20% of the labor force, and in big cities the numbers were even worse.
If you are going to do a bailout, then bail out really fast before you have absolutely terrible consequences to deal with. We have a clip that shows us how fast our leaders reacted to the Silicon Valley Bank disaster.
It's important to note, President Biden does nothing at 9 a.m. He is a night owl. So the fact that he is doing this at 9 a.m. anyway speaks to how vital the White House recognizes it is for him to have his voice out there, conveying that to the American public.
Does anyone know at what time did he give this speech where he said that GM electrified the whole industry? If it was at 9 a.m., then I think that means he actually was serious. If it wasn't, maybe he was joking. I don't think he was joking. Definitely not joking. Overall, though, I think it is pretty clear that we can trust our politicians to bail out the banks if that is really needed. I mean, they may get up a little bit late, but they will bail the banks out. And while Elon Musk says that there are some similarities between right now and 1929, I think there are a lot of differences too, and I don't think that we are going into such a big economical depression. I mean, we may have a recession and things may get bad, but I don't think they would get that bad unless we have a global boxing match between countries. Man, okay, that would be an absolute, utter disaster. Hopefully that does not happen. But I think we'll be just fine for now, economically speaking, and I'm keeping all of my Tesla stock, and this is the Tesla stock buying opportunity explained by Elon Musk. My name is Matt Posius. Like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.